Maybe leave the shooting to people who can actually hit something, Gramps.
Maybe leave the shooting to people who can actually hit something, Gramps. This isn't bingo night. That's what Brett Carlin said, loud enough for the whole firing line to hear, while a 77-year-old man sat quietly on a bench behind him, with a paper cup of cold coffee going colder in his hands. Brett had $3,000 of rifle on his shoulder and a 40-yard steel plate in front of him that he had not touched in 11 tries. The old man had said only one thing the entire morning. "Wind's quartering off your 2, son, not your 10. And for that he got laughed at by 4 young men in flat-brim hats who were certain that the dirt geysering around the plate was the fault of everything in the world except themselves. If you have ever been written off because of grey hair, a slow walk, and a jacket older than the people mocking you, do me a favour and type respect in the comments right now, because the men this story is about almost never ask for it, and almost always deserve it." His name was Earl Dawson, and he came to the Cedar Hollow Public Range most Saturdays the way other men go to church. He always took the same bench, the one back by the spotting scopes where the morning sun didn't glare. He wore the same canvas jacket, faded to the colour of a creek bed, with a frayed cuff he'd stitched himself more than once. He drank his coffee slow. He didn't shoot much anymore, a few rounds from an old bolt gun carefully like a man counting change, and mostly he just watched. The range officers knew him by his first name and not much else. He never talked about himself. When new shooters asked the white-haired man on the bench if he'd ever been in the service, he'd smile and say, "Long time ago, different world." Then he'd change the subject to their groups, their breathing, the way they were yanking the trigger instead of pressing it. Some listened, most didn't. Earl had made a long and patient peace with not being listened to. That Saturday the line was crowded, and Brett Carlin's group owned the loudest lane on it. They had matching rifle bags, a tripod with a $500 spotting scope nobody was using to spot, and a phone propped up recording everything for an account with a name like Trigger Life. They were shooting at a 40-yard steel silhouette, the kind of plate a competent rifleman should ring with monotonous boredom, and they were missing it with creative variety. Low left, low right, a spray of dust over the top. Brett blamed his dope. His buddy Travis blamed the ammo, said the lot was junk. The third kid blamed the wind. And the wind, to be fair, was a lazy 6 miles an hour that wouldn't have moved a balloon. They were loud about it. They laughed every time the steel stayed silent, the kind of laugh that's mostly performance. And between strings they talked about how the range itself was trash, and the backstop was throwing rounds. Earl watched all of it from the bench without a word for the better part of an hour. He watched Brett heel the rifle into his shoulder wrong. He watched Travis close his eyes a half second before every shot. He watched 4 young men who had bought every possible solution except the only ones that mattered. Patience, humility, and 1,000 quiet repetitions. And he felt something old and familiar settle in his chest. Not anger exactly, more like the ache of a thing remembered. When Brett missed his 11th shot and slammed his palm on the bench and announced to the line that this whole range is a joke, Earl finally stood up. His knees took a second to agree with him. He walked over, slow, and he didn't reach for a rifle. He just asked in that soft gravel voice, "Mind if an old man borrows your lane for 1 minute? I won't touch your gun." Brett looked at his friends and grinned the grin of a man who has just been handed content. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, absolutely. Show us how it's done, Chief." Travis turned the phone toward Earl. Somebody behind them said, half under his breath, "This is going to be sad," and a couple of people chuckled. Earl didn't seem to hear it, or if he did, it didn't register on his face. He reached into the inside pocket of that creek-coloured jacket and took out 2 things. The first was a strip of leather, supple and dark, about as long as a man's arm, with a wider woven cradle in the middle, and a loop on one end worn shiny from a thumb that had ridden it for half a century. The second was a small canvas pouch, and from it he shook 3 smooth river stones into his palm, each one about the size of a large marble, rounded by water over a length of time none of those boys could conceive of. "What is that?" Brett said, and it wasn't really a question. "Is that a sling? Like a David and Goliath thing?" The laughter started up again, easier now, relieved, because this was even better than they'd hoped. The old man wasn't going to embarrass them by being good. He was going to embarrass himself with a piece of leather and a rock. Earl said nothing. He stepped to the firing line, set his feet shoulder-width with the left slightly forward, and seated one stone in the cradle. He held the loop on his middle finger and pinched the release tab between thumb and forefinger. He didn't whirl it around his head like cartoons do. He let it hang and drop behind him, took one breath the way he'd once taught 100 frightened young men to take a breath, and brought his whole body through in a single smooth motion, like a man cracking a whip he'd been born holding. The stone left the sling at something north of 100 miles an hour. Nobody on that line actually saw it travel. What they heard, a quarter second later, was a sound that shut every mouth in the place at once. A deep, clean, ringing gong off the centre of the 40-yard plate. The sound those 4 young men had been chasing for an hour and had not produced a single time. The steel was still swinging on its chain when Earl seated the second stone. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even look pleased. He looked the way a carpenter looks after driving a nail. He stepped, dropped, came through. Gong. Dead center again. The phone in Travis's hand was shaking because Travis's hand was shaking. Gong. 3. A man 2 lanes down had taken his ear protection off without realizing it. Gong. 4. Brett Carlin had stopped grinning somewhere around 2 and now just stood there with his expensive rifle hanging off his shoulder like something he'd stolen. Gong. 5. The whole range had gone silent except for the swing of that chain and the old man's slow breathing. He reached into the pouch, and there was only 1 stone left, and he set it, and he didn't rush, and he sent it, and the 6th strike hit so true the plate didn't even wobble sideways. It just rocked straight back and forward like a bell that had been rung on purpose, which it had. 6 stones, 6 hits, 40 yards. A 77-year-old man with a strip of leather. On the lane, 4 young men with $3,000 of equipment couldn't touch. Nobody laughed. The silence had a weight to it. Earl bent down, slowly, with one hand on his knee, and began picking his stones up out of the dirt one at a time, dropping them back in the pouch with a soft click each, the way you'd return borrowed tools. It was Brett who finally spoke, and his voice had lost every bit of its swagger. "Where?" he said, and had to start over. "Where does somebody even... How does an old man learn to throw a rock like that?" Earl straightened up. He looked at the boy for a long moment, not unkindly, the way you look at someone you've decided to forgive in advance. "Wasn't always old," he said. And he might have left it there. He had left it there 1,000 times before with better people than these, except that a woman's voice came across the line behind them, sharp and certain. That was Sandra Pike, the range manager, who had come out of the office at the first gong and had been standing very still by the rack ever since. But she wasn't looking at Earl. She was looking at the man walking up beside her. A tall man in his late 70s with a steel-grey flat top and a posture that 30 years of retirement hadn't bent, who had driven 2 hours that morning to teach a long-range clinic in the afternoon and had come out to see what all the silence was about. He had stopped about 15 feet behind Earl Dawson and gone the colour of paper. His name was Thomas Royce, and the last time most people had said it formally, it had a star in front of it. Brigadier General, United States Air Force, retired. He was not looking at the sling like the rest of them were. He was looking at the man holding it, and his eyes were doing something that did not belong on the face of a general. "Nail 4-1, General Royce said. It came out cracked. The words meant nothing to anyone on that line except one man, and that one man's hand closed slowly around the leather. Royce took a step forward. "I went down a hoist over the Bolivan Plateau in the spring of 1971 to pull a bird dog pilot out of the trees who was supposed to be one man. 1. That's what the report said. 1 survivor, 11 days on the run." His voice was climbing and breaking at the same time. He turned, not to Earl, but to Brett Carlin and the phone and the whole frozen line, because some stories have to be told to the people who need them most. This man flew an O-1 forward air controller out of Nakhon Phanom, the Nail AC's 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron. He was marking targets along the trail when he took ground fire and went into the canopy and country. We did not officially have men in. He had no rifle. He had no rations. The North Vietnamese had trackers on him within a day because everyone wanted a downed American pilot, and the jungle there does not feed you for free. He stopped. He looked at the sling again, and now everyone understood why he couldn't take his eyes off it. And he was not one man, Royce said, quieter now, which somehow made it land harder. When I came down that penetrator on the 11th day, he was carrying his backseater, Lieutenant Danny Voss. 23 years old, compound fracture of the lower leg from the crash, couldn't walk a step. Procedure, survival, evasion, the whole cold arithmetic of it, said leave the man who can't move and save the man who can. 11 days this pilot dragged and carried a kid through enemy ground, set that leg with 2 sticks and a flight glove, and kept them both alive. You want to know how, son? He pointed at the leather in Earl's hand without looking away from Brett. He grew up poor in the Ozarks, knocking squirrels out of hickory trees with a sling his grandfather braided, because rifle shells cost money and a creek stone cost nothing. The one weapon, he used to say, that never runs out of ammunition. He fed 2 men for 11 days on birds and a young deer he took with that. He took out a tracker's lantern at 60 yards in the dark so the man behind it would think twice about how close he wanted to come. When I reached them, Danny Voss was alive and arguing, which is the only way you knew Danny Voss was alive. They put the Air Force Cross on this man, and he wore it exactly once, and then he stopped talking about any of it, because the men who do the most are almost always the men who say the least. You could have heard a stone drop. Brett Carlin was not holding his rifle like a trophy anymore. He was holding it the way you hold something heavy you suddenly don't deserve, and his face had gone slack and red, and the phone in Travis's hand had quietly stopped recording, because Travis had forgotten it existed. The young man who had said, "This is going to be sad," was looking at the dirt. General Royce closed the last few feet between himself and Earl Dawson, and a brigadier general in front of a public firing line full of strangers came to attention and rendered a slow, full salute to a man in a creek-coloured jacket who'd spent the morning being laughed at on a bench. "Lieutenant Voss made it home, Earl," Royce said, low, just between the two of them now, though everyone heard it. 31 more years, married, 2 daughters. There are grandchildren in Missouri who exist because a kid from the Ozarks wouldn't put down a piece of leather. I have been trying to find you for a long time. Earl Dawson didn't say anything for a moment. His jaw worked. His eyes were wet and he let them be, which is its own kind of courage at 77 on a Saturday in public. He returned the salute, the old reflex still clean in the body that remembered it. Then he did the thing that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He turned to Brett Carlin, the boy who'd called him Gramps, who'd called the Ranger joke, who'd pointed a camera at him to make a fool of him, and he held out one of the smooth river stones from the canvas pouch. "It's not the gear," Earl said gently. "It never was. It's the 10,000 throws nobody filmed. You've got good hands, son. You just haven't missed enough yet to get good." Brett took the stone with a hand that wasn't steady, and he couldn't get a word out, and he didn't try to, because some apologies are better made by simply shutting up and listening, which he finally did. The range never did get loud again that day. Brett Carlin put the phone away and spent the next hour standing next to a 77-year-old man on a bench, asking quiet questions and getting quiet answers about wind and breath and patience. Travis deleted the video he'd been so proud of and posted instead a single photo of an old strip of leather lying across a worn canvas knee, with no caption that could possibly do it justice. The other 2 boys came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and they brought him coffee, hot this time, in his cup the way he liked it. And every one of them learned the thing the whole story was really about, that the man on the bench you didn't bother to look at, the slow walker, the quiet one, the one with the frayed cuff and the soft voice, has very often done harder things in worse places for better reasons than anyone laughing at him will do in their entire lives. And the only difference between honouring that and missing it completely is whether you bother to ask before you laugh. Earl Dawson still goes to the Cedar Hollow Range most Saturdays. He still takes the back bench. He still drinks his coffee slow and watches the young ones yank their triggers, and now, more often than not, one of them walks over before they laugh and asks the old man if he wouldn't mind taking a look. He always does. He never mentions the plateau, or the 11 days, or the kid he carried, or the medal in a drawer he hasn't opened. But sometimes, when the line is quiet and the light is right, he'll pull a single smooth stone out of an old canvas pouch, roll it once between 2 fingers, and put it back. The one weapon he'll tell you if you've earned the telling that never runs out. If this story moved you, if you believe the quietest man on the bench has earned the bench, type respect in the comments one more time, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel, because we are here for exactly one reason: to make sure the men who never asked to be seen are never, ever forgotten.